Hello and welcome to the CCAG public broadcast. Human development has ushered in an era of converging crises: climate change, ecological destruction, disease, pollution, and socio-economic inequality. In response, we must take comprehensive, integrated action. Those words are taken from Earth at Risk, a new report from an interdisciplinary group of experts, including our own Sir David King, which is an urgent call to end the age of destruction and forge a just and sustainable future. But have we got what it takes? Can humanity rise to the occasion? To discuss Earth at Risk, I'm joined today by our CCAG experts, Sir David King, Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, Professor Mercedes Bustamante. I also like to welcome our guest, Sam Hampton, researcher at the University of Oxford and the University of Bath, Shouro Dasgupta, environmental economist and visiting senior fellow at Grantham Research Institute, LSE, and we're also joined by Olumide Idowu, a climate campaigner in Nigeria who has shared a pre-recorded video. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's really good to have you with us. So let's kick off with Sir David King. Please tell us more about Earth at Risk and its critically important recommendations.
So this is a paper, the purpose of which is to draw attention to the careless, foolish way humanity is gambling with the future. And it's a very comprehensive paper that pulls together all of the challenges we're currently faced with. The authors on the next slide are a group of 19 interdisciplinary experts, as you've just heard. But I want to first of all give a tribute to Chip Fletcher, the first author, who first drafted this paper several years ago. And the co-authors have been all working on it from their disciplinary viewpoint. I think this is a critically important paper, and I'm very pleased, we all are, that it's been published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the USA, because this is one of the leading journals in the world for this to be placed into. If I can take you to the next slide, thank you. We know that we have had a series of challenges over the converging crisis situation. Climate change, we're very familiar with. I'll say a few words about that. Ecological destruction, what is happening to biodiversity? And we know that climate change and biodiversity are separated into two separate United Nations Framework Conventions. What we need to do is bring it all together, because we've got to understand climate change, ecological destruction, disease, pollution, socio-economic inequality. These are all the challenges that underscore the urgent need for a comprehensive, integrated action process to deal with it. The comfortable era ushered in by the climate period, the Holocene, is now rapidly being drawn to an end through our own careless actions. If I could just, yes, the next slide. There's far too much information on this slide, but the purpose of this is to say the paper deals with every issue given on this slide. We're saying that the population growth, and let me just quickly say a few words about population growth. It's not just population growth. We've had an economic system that in many respects has been extremely successful in creating human well-being across the planet. And at the same time, that system has converted itself into a system that puts no value on the natural world. So we have suffered from the fact that, particularly in the West, we separate out ourselves from nature. We treat ourselves as apart from nature and not a part of nature. And in the process, we are now destroying the ecosystems that give us the ability to survive. So I think the general gist of this slide is just to say we need to look at this as a as a whole and not to take it part by part. And we need to then focus on an integrated set of actions to deal with the situation. In the next slide, we're just saying this is summarizing the system, the economic system that we had, this expansive system, imperialism, extractive capitalism, producing a surging population where, once again, wealth creation is the biggest driver. And as a result, we are now speeding past the Earth's material limits to manage the increased demand from this increasing population. But we're also destroying the ecosystems on which we depend. They're triggering irreversible changes. Note the word irreversible in biophysical systems that underpin the Holocene climate stability which fostered human civilization. So next slide. So the consequences of these actions are disproportionately borne by vulnerable populations. And that, of course, has been true for many hundreds of years, but now we're seeing it really entrenching in terms of global inequalities. Now take me to the next slide. And what we also know is that the biodiversity in marine and terrestrial systems is facing critical tipping points. We're seeing escalating challenges to human food and water access. And in addition, we have these massive challenges from the destruction of biomes in both marine and terrestrial systems. These foreshadow, and I can't pull punches here, a bleak outlook for global security. Let me take you through the next slides. This one is looking at it's called the 2-meter temperature world because that is the way in which temperatures are recorded 2 meters above the surface. And we're simply showing the annual January to December trends in global temperatures from 1940 through to 2023 and coming into 2024. So 2023 is the red curve. The black curve on the left, just coming in on January, is the 2024 figures. And what we see from this is the lowest grey curve on here is the 1940 curve, and the temperature rise is fairly systematic going forward in time. But I do have to draw attention to the fact that there is an enormous difference in the temperature rise just in the year 2023 compared not only with the previous daily record, but also compared with the figure for 2022 and the figure from earlier years. So this is in red, the hatched area in red is just emphasizing that 2023 was an exceptionally hot year, and many, many people suffered from that. Heat stress is a major challenge to our ability to survive. But what I think is also critically important here is to understand this is we anticipated, driven by an El Nino event, this kind of event that happens every 5 to 7 years, and temperatures rise unusually during the El Nino period. But this is the most radical change that we've seen in an El Nino period. We were anticipating this to begin around October. It actually began around April. You can see the diversion, April, May, through to June. And so it's really quite an unusual high temperature. But the next slide emphasizes, if I could have, the same January to December variation over the period, actually this one is 1981 to 2021, for the surface temperature of the oceans of the world. And so what you see again in red is the 2023 figure. Now this is quite startling. What you see is that the ocean average surface temperature increased dramatically in 2023 compared with previous years. Again, going back to March, April, we see this enormous change. And that you may say that 0.3 degrees centigrade is not a large change, but in terms of annual changes, which are normally a bit less than 0.1 degrees centigrade, this is more than a little worrying. And finally, the next slide has a similar figure again, taking us from January to December, showing global sea ice extent. Critically important to understand that sea ice, together with ice on land, is reflecting sunlight away from the planet back into space. Ice therefore keeps the whole planet cooler by this process. There's a second process by which it keeps us cooler, which is that as ice melts, the melting of the ice takes up a large amount of energy, the so-called latent heat of melting. And as the sea ice melts and that no longer happens, we've got yet another driver of increased temperatures globally. So what we see again here is that 2023 was an unusual year for ice melt from the oceans of the world. And the next slide, please. So what we're calling for is a global response. Now, when we say global response, we actually mean that. We mean every society of the world needs to look at the causes for what we're currently doing to our livable planet and essentially making it unlivable. We need urgent decarbonization. And what we have at the moment is policies of various countries which appear to be good. They are showing that renewable energy systems are coming onto grids much more quickly than in the past. But at the same time, the same countries are often seeking to find more oil, gas, and coal, and are marking their future in terms of continued use of fossil fuels going forward. We need to learn that we are a part of nature, so fostering reciprocity with nature is a big part of the way forward. Implementing regenerative practices, the notion of a circular economy has been emerging quite recently. We need to see that we manage our natural resources properly in all of our practices, and we need to attempt to reduce waste to a minimum, if not to zero. In the natural world, there is no waste. There is a recycling process going on, and we need to learn how we can, in the future, live with that process. In particular, we're pointing out the vast number of detrimental subsidies around the world, particularly for fossil fuel extraction. The promotion of equitable human development is another important factor. How do we develop equity from one country to another, from one community to another, across the whole world? And we need to look at transformative financial support, in particular lower income nations, to enable them to progress not only their development, but also to progress with this whole process of managing transformative development. Next slide, please. So we need a critical paradigm shift. We need a cultural shift. We need to come to an end of exploitative, wealth-oriented capitalism, and we must move on to an economic model that prioritizes sustainability, resilience, and justice. We need an economic model which requires that we give equal prominence to managing our ecosystems and to manage human well-being, including equity. So we advocate a global cultural shift that elevates kinship with nature and communal well-being, underpinned by the recognition of Earth's finite resources and the interconnectedness of its inhabitants. The next slide. This slide is a figure in the paper that summarizes really what we're talking about. On the left-hand side are the current problems: socioeconomic inequality, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, disease. And on the right-hand side, the way forward: social equity, reciprocity with nature, environmental justice. Now, all of this is not intended at all to be wishful thinking. We need processes to be put in place to make the transition from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of this diagram, so that we alter our human values to take into account the need for ourselves and for future generations and for the biodiverse systems of the world, all pictured together, that we take them forward on this basis. Next slide. So in order to move away from this precipice that we're facing, and in many ways already beginning to fall down, we must collectively harness political will, economic resources, and societal values. We need to look for examples around the world where we can pick up on the good practices that we're aiming towards. And one of the groups of peoples in the world that we're looking at are the people who live in forests and have lived in forests for thousands of years, the people who live on the permafrost up in the Arctic Circle region, the people who live on deserts. Those people have always lived in a sustainable way with nature. Now, we can't live in that way without making an enormous transition, and nor am I suggesting we can live in that way, but we can learn from them. They have a reverence for nature because they know that their lives depend on nature. These are the indigenous people, and we quote one of our authors, our co-authors, is an indigenous person. And he is saying, actually, I think we are all indigenous. We're all indigenous to the planet, and we need to recognize that. And if we're all indigenous, that means we can form a single community. So it should not come at the cost of ecological integrity and social equity, because we're forgetting, if we do run that cost, we're forgetting that we are a part of our ecosystems. I think that's the last slide. Yes. So thank you very much. I just go back to where I started. We have been careless. We have been foolish in the way that humanity is gambling with the future. Now we need to take a broad look at this and then see how we can take the right actions to take our way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir David, for that sobering summary of the Earth at Risk report. You know, I read the report and I found it depressing, illuminating, and it also anger-inducing, you know, in terms of all the mistakes that we're making. But what was great was to see that there are solutions there. There is a way out of this. But the frustration is, you know, how we get there, how we get to this way out. Look, so Dave, it'd be remiss of me not to mention that as we're recording this discussion, it's the 8th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Agreement. And so, David, as the UK government's chief science advisor, you played a significant role in the 2015 negotiations. Earth at Risk reiterates that we must harness political will to step back from the precipice of climate collapse. I think the exact quote is, we must collectively harness political will, economic resources, and societal values to steer towards a future where human progress does not come at the cost of ecological integrity and social equity. Can you elaborate on this and tell us, how do we achieve this?
So the first thing is to say that the framework agreed in 2015. You started by referring to that. The COP process in that year was one that I've pushed for That was the 1.5 degree centigrade target. But also, I also pushed for the introduction of nationally determined contributions, which was the weakest point of that agreement. So why did I push for it? Because without that, President Obama could not have signed, and the Chinese had said they wouldn't sign if America didn't sign. It was crucial to understand why Obama couldn't sign, and the reason is simply because his Senate and Congress wouldn't give him approval, their approval, for an international body to tell the United States what to do. So it had to be nationally determined contributions. So each country put forward its plans. Now, even those plans are nowhere near enough, but nevertheless, we began the move in the right direction with full agreement of all nations. However, and here's the biggest problem, I think, Ade, the power of the incumbent industries, the power of the very wealthy people, and in particular, the power of the fossil fuel lobby. What are we doing taking a COP meeting into a fossil fuel-based country and then following it with another fossil fuel-based country, and in each case with the president of the COP as the person responsible for oil production in their country? This is the power of the giants of the world to stop what we all believe is the right way forward. And I'm just going to remind ourselves that David did beat Goliath. And we need to just remember that we have got right on our side, and we really need to push this very hard. Biodiversity has been, as I said, treated as a separate issue. It all comes together. It is the way that we humans in the population, our mode of operation is self-destructive. Now, we need to get that understanding through and get it through quickly.
I think it's a fascinating answer. The realpolitik of trying to harness political will and what you were trying to do on getting the US on board. But there's something you said in the summary which I think underpins everything, and that's how do we get the world to value nature again? At the moment we've got these conflicting ideologies of the fossil fuel lobby and the fossil fuel companies, which are providing income and providing wealth in a lot of ways, but destruction in other ways. And it's us unpicking that. And perhaps when we speak with Mercedes next, and Lorraine as well, we can delve deeper into the psychological side of things. But so David, thank you for that start. That was a really, really good way to kick us off. Professor Bustamante, can I come to you next? And, Earth at Risk describes the interwoven emergencies of the climate crisis, but I wanted to focus particularly on ecological destruction and how we can restore balance. Now, according to the report, only 2.9% of the Earth's land remains ecologically intact. I mean, that's just astounding to read that stat. And it really drives home the role of our exploitative and extractive global economic model in this destruction. So can you unpack this for us? How can we rebalance our relationship with nature? How do we get the world to value nature again?
Now, thank you, Ade. And as Sir David mentioned, and you also reinforce, we need to redefine our understanding of value. So we need to understand how we are interconnected to nature. And there are some critical steps for that. I think that the first aspect that is important to take very urgent action is to protect natural habitats. They are crucial that we need to maintain natural habitats to preserve human health, biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and climate. So protecting these remaining natural habitats, we can ensure integrity and functioning of land, fresh waters, and ocean, and also to support human health. This is one of the aspects of this very nice report that was presented here, women well-being and also community resilience. I think the second important aspect is to restore ecosystem integrity. As you mentioned, we have a very small share of land on Earth and fresh waters and ocean that are still in good shape. And we need really to work more hard to restore degraded habitats. So restoring damaged ecosystems and reconnected isolated fragments can help to restore the stability of natural environments. The third aspect, and Sir David mentioned that, we have two global crises. This is the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, and they are strongly linked. So we need to safeguard natural species diversity. So ecosystems that are more stable where native species diversity is higher. So there are a lot of measures. This is what we call area-based conservation measures, like protected areas or indigenous and community conserved areas that can help to protect species diversity and by extension the health of the overall ecosystems. And again, I would like to reinforce the critical role of indigenous and traditional communities. They are custodians of the last remaining natural ecosystems on Earth, and they need really to be protected in terms of their land rights and the way they are living. And the other critical aspect is also related to international trade. So how we can have green supply chains, more sustainable commodity trains that can reduce deforestation, pollution, unsustainable land practices. And therefore, we need, again, to put natural capital approach at the heart of the economic and business decision-making so that we can promote cleaner and greener supply chains. And the last aspect that I would like to reinforce in terms of trying to rebalance this relation with nature, it is really, we need to agree on ambitious international environmental policies. You mentioned the Paris Agreement here, so we are not on the track to reach the 1.5 goal. So we really need to rethink the way we are dealing with this international agreement and how we can be more ambitious. So multilateral environmental agreements, this is a global crisis, as was mentioned here. We need the participation of all governments and societies, but they need to have measurable targets, accountability, transparency, and also associated means for implementation so that can help to safeguard the ecosystem. So, and again, so financial systems must help to implement all these measures. So I think that these are, in my opinion, the main steps that we need to take to rebalance our relationship with nature.
Thank you, Professor Mercedes. Look, you've made really clear what are the things we need to do to rebalance our relationship with nature. But it's also quite clear that there is a difference between the drivers of what's happening and causing this ecological imbalance between the global north and the global south. You know, how do they differ in their approaches and to basically damaging our planet?
Yeah, as you mentioned about the remaining natural ecosystems in the world, most of them are in the global south. And the global south also has experienced for 100 years the effects of colonialism and imperialisms, all these points that were also mentioned in this report. So we really need to have a systems where voice can be heard, and we really need to work on equity because this is a critical issue. In the global south, we still have a very unequal distribution of means of life. So people that are dependent on nature are under pressure and under higher risk, and we need to help them to do that. So, but in this way, I think that the global north must recognize their responsibility in this crisis and also put the means to help the global south to avoid the same mistakes that made in the past. So it's really, as I mentioned, the last point is quite important, how we can have ambitious international agreements, environmental policies that can deal with this unequal share of the responsibilities and risks that are related to this global crisis.
Yep, inequality looms large.
Yeah.
When it comes to climate change, and you know it's really frustrating and horrible to see how much damage is being done to the world and how the people who do the least in the global south are paying the biggest price. Thank you, Professor Mercedes Bustamante, for that contribution. I want to move on to Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh now. So, Lorraine, Earth at Risk calls for systemic change to forge a just and sustainable future, with something as large scale as a global shift in values. So, I mean, where do we even begin with this, Lorraine? It's such a massive mindset as to where we're at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the evidence on social transformation makes clear that change is required at every level, from the state to markets and technologies to communities, and importantly, individual lifestyles and practices. And that often implies a shift in societal values and norms and belief systems. And that's particularly clear for sustainability and climate change. We absolutely need a cultural shift in our values, our norms, and the behaviours that we take, particularly in relation to consumption. And this is perhaps the hardest element of a social transformation, really, is to think about shifting values and cultural norms, because they are entrenched and taken for granted. They're almost invisible. And because the dominant sort of institutions tend to lock in those values, so that it's difficult. But the report points to a number of areas where we can start to change people's values. The first one is around changing cultural narratives. Now, the report includes some very compelling and powerful and quite terrifying statistics around the ecological and climate challenges that we're facing. But actually, it's through storytelling that we can really foster a deeper connection with other people and motivate and mobilize people to take action, much more than statistics by themselves. And we know that the dominant Western cultural narratives and stories that we have are often assume that people are separate to nature, that we're not dependent on it, and that we should pursue our own individual and not collective goals. And we have this very pervasive myth of consumption, which is that buying things, having bigger houses, bigger cars, taking foreign holidays will make us happy. And actually, the evidence tells us the opposite is in fact true. And it's connection to other people, connection to nature, feelings of competence and agency. Those are the sorts of things that improve our well-being, and absolutely not consumption. And the report highlights the fact that actually we can learn from other cultures, indigenous cultures, collectivist cultures, to reframe our relationship with nature and ideas of progress and happiness. That we can use art and creative means to emotionally connect with people. We know that can be more powerful than sort of facts and so on. And that can really shape people's action and inspire them to take action. Crucially, it needs to be these new sorts of narratives that we need to create need to be embedded within the media. So they need to be normalizing and really exemplifying low carbon lifestyles and practices. But also of education. So this is also flagged in the report. So education, we know, can help shift values and drive structural change and transformation. Education for sustainable development emphasizes long-term and systems thinking over siloed thinking and short-term immediate goals. And interestingly, some recent work that my colleague Catherine Lee at the University of Bath has just done, she's reviewed school curricula in the UK to look at how climate change is taught to young people. And it focuses primarily on technological solutions, the supply side of energy systems, and really reduces the role of people altogether to thinking about them being consumers at best, that they could maybe buy green technologies. And it doesn't really talk about the wider roles that people can play, the fact that actually people are not only consumers, but they're citizens, they're members of communities, they might be parents, they're professionals, they're role models to the people around them. There are so many different roles that we can play, and I think we'll hear more about that from Sam Hampton shortly. But really, fundamentally, the curriculum is not inspiring young people to take action in that much more varied way. And it's actually likely to be exacerbating climate anxiety amongst those young people because they feel disempowered. So there is a huge role that education can play to create a sense of empowerment, to show the different roles that people can play, to create positive change in society, individually and collectively, and also to challenge problematic narratives, teach young people that consumption doesn't lead to happiness, that humans are part of and dependent on nature. And finally, value change can also be triggered by and accelerated through leadership. And some new polling by Ipsos Mori out this week in time for Earth Day found that around the world, in all of the different countries that they polled, only about 3 in 10 people say that their governments are showing leadership on climate change. And large majorities in these countries say they want their governments to do more. People look to leaders to show them what sustainable action looks like and to enable them to be part of a sustainable transformation. And that's not currently happening at the moment. What we're seeing is that governments are saying climate and sustainability are important, but their actions say otherwise. And that's demotivating citizens and businesses and others to take action. Leadership isn't only about governments, but they are a very critical sort of indicator of leadership. People are also, though, influenced by members of their family, people in their communities, employers, inspirational figures in the media. And so it's about thinking about how we all might exert influence through the different roles we have and recruit these trusted messengers to champion and exemplify sustainable values and practices. So all of these things together, I think, can help contribute to a shift in the values that we need.
Professor Whitmarsh, that was really fascinating, but I feel like the elephant in the room here is as we hear all these stats about how much and how important the public, especially in the UK, see climate change in their lives and wanting to do something about it, and also trying to change our education system and curriculum to get more kids to understand and feel empowered about it. But politically, I don't feel that our leaders see votes in it. They don't believe that if they go on a climate agenda, that they will win. They don't. I don't think they believe that they will get votes that way, and that disconnect means we're going to be constantly in this cycle. How do we get our leaders to suddenly start becoming, more green?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some good work by Becky Willis at Lancaster University that's shown that actually the perceived lack of mandate from voters, what has been in the past a really big impediment to politicians and leaders taking more ambitious climate action. Now, the evidence is overwhelming that the public really wants more action on climate change. They want to see more leadership by governments, and they want to play their part and to be helped by governments to do that. So the evidence is there that the public does demand this of their leaders. And when it comes to actually voting and so on, while climate might not be for many groups necessarily the top thing that they're choosing their party on, it will be one of the things they're looking at. And where parties are saying it's not at all a priority, that will of course undermine voter confidence. It will not be attractive for voters. And importantly, I think it's about aligning the other things that voters are interested in, like addressing the cost of living crisis, health concerns, biodiversity loss, all these other things that people are absolutely understandably concerned about, and saying, addressing many of these things, we need to address climate and sustainability as part of addressing these things. These are not incompatible, in fact. So the solutions often are part and parcel. So it's about actually saying it's not either or, we can do both.
As usual, it is about connecting the dots. It's about putting together that very complicated jigsaw of politics and everyday life. Thank you so much, Lorraine. It was really valuable insight. And in another recent report, both you and our guest, Sam Hampton, discuss the role that wealthier people have to play in tackling the climate crisis. Sam, welcome. And it would be really great if you could talk us through the concept of carbon capability and how this differs for the wealthiest?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, this concept of carbon capability needs a bit of explanation. So
Sam, could you start again? Sorry, we missed that first bit.
okay, I started by saying thanks for having me, so that was easy. Yeah, so carbon capability does need a bit of explaining. So I'll begin with the kind of academic definition and then explain what that means in practice. So carbon capability is the ability to make informed judgments and to take effective decisions regarding the use and management of carbon through both individual behavior change and collective action. So the idea and the reason I think it's a compelling framework is that it takes us beyond thinking about individuals' knowledge or literacy about climate change, actually to focus on what people do, actual behaviors, and crucially, what are the barriers and enablers to adopting low carbon practices. So there are a couple of elements which mark it out from kind of other ways of thinking about behavior change. First is the shift from a focus on individual choices and decisions to a strong emphasis on what we call systems of provision, the kind of structures of the economy and politics and society. So these refer to things like transport infrastructure, which makes it more or less easy to swap car travel for other modes, or the availability of good quality low carbon food options in restaurants and etc. And then the second idea is that individuals, like Lorraine just said, can wear different hats. So there tends to be a lot of focus on our roles as consumers, and it can be quite guilt inducing. How do we persuade people to just consume less? But this actually encourages us to think more about other roles, like Lorraine said, as professionals, citizens, voters, investors, what we do with our money, and also social influence, because it's crucial that we just get more people talking about climate change. And I think that's relevant to what you were saying about kind of building that groundswell of political kind of support actually begins with just kind of having more conversations. So here is where I think it helps us to think about how wealthy people are quite often different from the rest of us. So firstly, we know that they have very high levels of consumptions and emissions. So the report quotes this stat that globally the top 10% wealthiest emit more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions. And so for that reason, we definitely can't say that many rich people's lives are sustainable, but actually we can say that they are capable in many ways. So the study that we conducted found that we looked at the top 10% in the UK, and we found that they are much more likely to be early adopters of key technologies like solar panels and electric vehicles. They're more likely to vote in general, but they're also more likely to vote for parties with strong green policies. And we found generally that they are kind of knowledgeable and aware of climate change, and their levels of concern are quite high. And they're actually also much more likely to talk frequently about climate change with friends, family, and colleagues. And of course, many rich people have important jobs and are in leadership positions, which give them significant influence. And they, as well, they also say they're quite open to trying to use their influence to persuade others to act on climate change. Taking aside the potential hypocrisy there. But I think it's worth saying really that there remain very, very few government policies and other kind of structures that would actually really address their kind of unfair contribution that rich people make. And there needs to be much more focus on how we can use their power, their influence, their capabilities to not only reduce their own impacts, but also to kind of make climate change more politically salient and to make low carbon choices much more normal in society.
Sam, one of the things you talk about having more knowledge of carbon capabilities and people being more aware of their carbon footprint, but I also get the feeling that a lot of people see low carbon or cutting down their carbon as taking a backward step in their lives and giving up the luxuries of the things that they've worked hard for. Especially not so much the wealthy people, more the people who are coming into the middle classes. I feel like in their minds they think we've worked really hard to be able to do all of these things, and now we can't. and everyone else has had that opportunity to do that. Yeah, how do we deal with that kind of mindset?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think it's important to return to what Lorraine was saying about kind of well-being and happiness and the relationship or the lack of relationship with consumption. And I think here there's different ways of thinking about this. There's standard of living is the kind of typical economic way of thinking about kind of well-being, and it's very related to what we consume, whereas actually kind of quality of life is a much more important measure. And actually, yeah, I think it's incumbent upon the decision makers and people who are kind of influential with the system to make it so that people can, as they aspire to greater lives, they come up the burgeoning middle classes, as you say, that it's actually then easy for them to take low carbon choices. I mean, we know that like cities that are dominated by cars are not fun places to be. And so that's like a nice example where, if everyone aspires to have a car, that's one thing, but no one aspires to live in a really congested, polluted city. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So it's about redesigning our cities so that people they can make those choices, and that the infrastructure is there available to kind of make aspirational choices. And so there's also a kind of question of norms as well. So making low carbon lifestyles attractive, like they are, like cycling in Holland is not seen in the same kind of light as it is in other countries. It's much more positive.
Now, it's a really good point you make there, Sam, and it is about the education of the making people understand that low carbon lifestyle doesn't necessarily mean a lifestyle that is less prosperous and a backward step. I mean, your example of Holland, I was in Amsterdam a few years back, and the thing that really struck me was because they have trams and because they put on massive subsidies so people were able to get electric cars, and because a lot of people cycle, we had the modes of transport were cycling, trams and electric vehicles, and it was so silent and so peaceful. And I felt for my own mental well-being, I felt like I was in a really great place, a low carbon place, and my mental health felt much better. So I think people really need to understand that low carbon doesn't mean a backward step. So Sam, thank you for that contribution. I really want to get on to one of our other speakers, Shouro Dasgupta. Shouro, welcome back, and thank you for joining us again. Now, the latest Lancet Countdown report reveals that the health risks of climate change are worsening, and this is echoed in the Earth at Risk report. For example, as the planet heats up, infectious diseases once confined to tropical regions are expanding their range. And we also know that the health impacts of climate change often disproportionately affect vulnerable communities, including low-income regions and communities of color. Shouro, could you tell us more about why and how this happens?
Hi, thank you for inviting me, Matt. It's great to be here, and greetings from the Albert Einstein Science Park in Potsdam. It's great listening to the other speakers. And as you said, I'm one of the authors of the Lancet Countdown report, so this is right down my line. Heat puts pressure on all of society and has cascading risks on human health, food security, and the labor force. And the fact that climate-related health risks are disproportionately felt by the socially disadvantaged population groups cannot be highlighted or emphasized enough. These are interconnected health impacts which affect people differently due to differences in exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. All this reflects intersecting patterns of various levels of socioeconomic development, marginalization, and of course, historical and ongoing patterns of inequality. Along with the Lancet Countdown report, I also want to draw attention to the first ever European climate risk assessment mandated by the European Parliament with the aim of supporting European Union policy development in climate-sensitive sectors. I led the health risk assessment, and we're very excited where this can take us. Back to the question. So some of the factors that make certain population groups at a higher risk. Age, for example, the elderly and the very young are simply more vulnerable because of the how health affects their bodies. Those with existing health conditions, they can have greater rates of physical disabilities, unfortunately poor mental health, higher proportions of kidney disease, diabetes, asthma, cardiovascular diseases. All this can be worsened by climate change impacts, and we're already seeing evidence that those with existing health conditions are more affected by, let's say, heat stress or droughts, for example. Income disparities. Low-income earners often lack resources to cope with climate-related health hazards. And we have seen over and over again in every part of the world, even in Europe, that low-income earners have a higher rate of climate-related health risks. Urban heat islands disproportionately affect low-income neighborhoods with inadequate green spaces and cooling infrastructure. Now, we keep talking about blue and green spaces, but we also have to remember that low-income neighborhoods often lack these blue and green spaces, which can mitigate some of the effects of climate change. Another issue with living conditions is that in many countries, poor people tend to live near highways, which tend to have higher levels of pollution, right? And they also have limited financial resources or cultural language barriers that restrict their access to healthcare, social services, and safe and nutritious food. And finally, heat stress has disproportionately higher impact on outdoor workers, right? They are simply more exposed to the elements. And just finally connecting this to the policy solutions that we often come out with, right? We need to remember that we may give the best, the most optimum policy solutions to people, but we'll also have to focus on whether they actually have the ability to obtain those policy solutions, right? We cannot go to a poor household in Bangladesh and tell them, well, you can no longer use wood for cooking because this is bad for your health. Well, their first question is going to be, well, how do I cook now? Give me a solution, right? So with this, I hope that answered your question. There was part rant, but also part of what I'm working on. Thank you.
Shouro, Dasgupta, thank you. That was excellent. You actually remind me of a quote that I heard where I was at a Global Inclusive Growth Summit in Washington last week. And the quote I heard was, don't give poor people poor solutions.
Exactly.
Give them the solutions that will work and solutions that will have a positive impact on their lives. So no, thank you. That was really important. And something else that I take from that is, we are currently all talking, especially here in Europe, about the immigration problem. People on the move. Climate change is going to exacerbate this even more.
Absolutely.
These people are living in these terrible conditions where life is hard, where there's battles over water, battles over their health because the heat is so high and the famine is growing and they can't grow their crops and food. They are going to move. So it's not just the lower income people or people of color that this is affecting. This is affecting all of us. Our world is interconnected, whether you like it or not. So we all have to play a part in this climate change battle.
Absolutely. And just one note about people on the move. We also have to think about not where they came from, but the route they take. That's because all the routes are becoming more and more dangerous. They are being exposed more and more to infectious diseases. And it's about helping people, not pointing fingers.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Shouro. Thank you for that contribution.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the Climate Voice section of today's meeting, and I'm delighted to turn to climate campaigner Olumide Idowu, who has shared a pre-recorded contribution with us today.
There is a crucial problem that is facing vulnerable communities all around the world, especially in the nations like Nigeria that we all know. This problem is caused by inaction about climate change. Pollution in the air is actually becoming an increasing important, social, climate, and health problem in Nigeria. and it is having a substantial impact on the country's population. Additionally, air pollution exacerbates the effect of climate change, which in turn leads to the occurrence of extreme weather patterns or events, destruction of ecosystem, and the overall loss of biodiversity in Nigeria as a country. This has the potential to put additional strain to communities that are vulnerable, that are already disadvantaged, and to impair the efforts to achieve sustainable development in the country. There is an absolute necessity for actions to be made in order to address the urgent occurrences or the urgent climate action or climate issues that we see. The reduction of emission, the steam in the clean air energy sources, and even implementation of policies that promote environmental sustainability and public health. If we are able to assist in the protection of vulnerable communities in Nigeria, then throughout the world, by addressing the interconnected concern of air pollution, climate change, and health, this will result in a future that is more sustainable and equitable for all.
Thank you, Olumide, for that contribution. Protecting vulnerable communities like those in Nigeria must be at the heart of our approach to tackling climate change. So, David King, can I get you to get your take, on what Olumide has said? He rightly mentions that implementing sustainable policies will lead to a more equitable future. You've mentioned this as well, but we know this makes fundamental economics and social sense. But why is it so difficult to achieve?
It's very difficult to achieve for the very simple reason, whether you're in Nigeria or Britain or the United States, the same economic principles operate, which is we need to create wealth, not we need to create well-being. And that predominance of looking at wealth is represented, for example, by our total focus on GDP and GDP growth as the measure of how well a country is doing. Now, in some ways, GDP is a good measure of indicating how well a country is doing, but in other ways, by having this one measure and no measures that reflect on human well-being and ecosystem well-being, we are bound to make these dreadful mistakes. So I just want to say something a little bit about one part of the world where they are talking about exactly the solution that we need to find. This is in China, and you may be surprised to hear me saying that, but in China, even in schools today, they've had communism in that country for a very long time. Even in schools today, Taoism is the principal culture that is taught. And what this means is, because Taoism treats us as a part of the natural world, that in China, it's no surprise to hear people talking the way we're talking now, as distinct from the way our capitalist free market system has been operating. What they've introduced, and this is now into the government of China, it's into their constitution, 2015, the notion of an ecological civilization. They actually define an ecological civilization as one in which equal priority is given to the well-being of our ecosystems and to the well-being of human beings. Equal importance. Now, interestingly, in that same phrase, they talk about the fact, of course, this should not only apply to China, it should apply to the whole world. So I think I'm picking on this as a model that has been worked through in China. Now, it is fair to say they're nowhere near an ecological civilization today. They've got a long way to go, but they have set themselves that as a target. And I think it's quite important that we pick up on what they are learning and then pick up from that in the way we go forward. I'm looking at this because I've been working in politics so much. I'm looking at this, frankly, from a political viewpoint. Making that transition does mean changing constitutions in governments so that whichever political party is elected would acknowledge that we all believe we need to head in towards an ecological civilization.
I think that's a really fascinating answer, Sir David King, because it's kind of a little bit at odds with the narrative that some Western countries have of China. You know, they talk about them as being one of the big drivers and one of the problems of climate change, but you're talking about them as potentially having the solution, especially in the way people think.
It's also quite important, Ade, if I can add this. In the year 2020, the President, Xi Jinping, announced that they would have 1,200 gigawatts, billion watts of renewable energy on the grid by 2030, 10 years. They've already achieved it this year.
Yeah.
They've achieved a 10-year target in 4 years. There is the ability in China to make decisions, to follow through on them, always making announcements that never quite match to the rate at which they make these transitions. So they are working very, very hard towards managing an economy that is not fossil fuel dependent, but their fossil fuel dependence has been driven by this massive increase in human well-being in China. Right, so all of this new middle class want to live the way we do, mistakenly in many ways.
Yeah, it's fascinating, very, very fascinating. I mean, the devil is always in the detail, as they say. When you look into the stats and the facts, you'll always get the true story of what's happening, or you kind of can if you can sort of work it out, how to read those stats. I want to really finally get some conversation with Professor Whitmarsh here. Much of the structural or systemic change that we need to see hinges on behavioral change. Are we approaching a positive tipping point here, Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh?
Yes and no, I think would be my answer. I think we do see some causes for optimism in terms of some of the behavioral trends that are seen around the world. I think maybe the obvious one is in terms of electric vehicle adoption. So there has all of the projections in terms of how quickly electric vehicles will be rolled out have been surpassed, and there is a huge acceleration of the adoption of electric vehicles that's really encouraging. I guess it's worth saying that electric vehicles are not the only solution to decarbonising transport, but they are a part of it. So that is encouraging in that sector, I would say. There are a few other examples which are rather more kind of locally based, or they're not sort of quite so universal. So sustainable diets, there's been a rise of plant-based diets in some developed countries, which is, I think, encouraging. Circular economy, again, in some countries we see the rise of kind of apps that enable people to give away some of their unwanted food that would otherwise go to waste, or to sell pre-loved clothes or other things to other people, this kind of peer-to-peer selling that reduces consumption. The cost of living crisis, of course, that many countries are going through means that people are saving energy and buying less in many cases in order to, mostly for financial reasons. But we know that those sorts of trends would only last as long as people feel the pinch financially. And so it's not necessarily a sort of longer term thing. And so I think it does also go back to what I said about the shift in values and norms around consumption, and what Sir Dave has just said about the fundamental economic systems that we are part of that measure progress in terms of wealth and not well-being. That actually some of these trends in consumption, while they are quite encouraging, the background is that actually they are somewhat limited when it comes to actually how we think about consumption more widely. So there's still these aspirations to buy more, to have more stuff, that are undermining where we need to be going on sustainability.
Yeah, very, very mixed, but there's definitely some positive signs. And on that that idea that we have in the world to measure wealth and not well-being, my question would be to people is, what is wealth without well-being? That's the thing that we should be looking at. Look, it's almost time for us to go. And but before we go, I just want to end the broadcast on a positive note. Recent analysis from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, reveals the tremendous economic power of clean energy, adding 320 billion US dollars to the world economy in 2023, which is equivalent to around 10% of global GDP. So definitely positive news there, and a reminder that when all seems lost, momentum is building for positive change. Look, this is all we have for time for today. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our guests, Shouro Dasgupta and Sam Hampton, for joining us, and to our members for another fascinating and engaging conversation. Thank you all for tuning in at home, and please feel free to share whatever you can from this broadcast on all of your social media platforms, and we look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. Bye-bye.